Hello, and welcome to Grand Dukes of the West. Episode 59, The Ghent Revolt, Part 1, That's Politics. Before we get started, I'm excited to announce that I'll be speaking at next year's Intelligent Speech Conference. For those of you who don't know, Intelligent Speech is an online conference featuring a number of your favorite history podcasters. This conference's theme is Companions and Rivals, and I'll be talking about one of my favorite rivalries, that of Charles the Bad and Charles V. You'll also be able to hear talks from The History of Persia, Totalis Rankium, The Alternate Historian, and more. Intelligent Speech will be February 28th, 2026, and you can purchase tickets and learn more at intelligentspeechonline.com. You can also use my promo code, BOLD, B-O-L-D, for 10% off. Last time, we left off with a brief discussion of Philip the Good's search for ever-increasing sums of money to pay for the ever-increasing cost of doing business. The financial pressures on the Duke had been rising for decades, and by the mid-1440s, the Burgundian state was in something of a financial crisis. The Duke of Burgundy dealt with this crisis in the short term by cutting costs, reducing salaries, and laying off court officers. And, as we saw last episode, some of the affected officers, such as Hugh de Lannoy, complained vociferously about these economies. But despite those complaints, these kinds of cuts were the easiest way for the Duke to make up the shortfalls in his budget. But here's the thing. The Duke's revenues in this period actually outweighed his expenditures. However, Philip's need for cash on hand forced him to constantly turn to credit to fund his court, his military expeditions, his government, and his household. As interest built up, he then was forced to pledge his future income to repay his existent loans, and so then had to take on more loans to pay for tomorrow's expenses, as tomorrow's income was already spoken for. So Philip the Good did not only need more income, he needed reliable income. A stream that could just keep coming in to pay for expenses. A way to have persistent cash in hand. An income source that he did not need to constantly renegotiate with the many representative assemblies throughout his territories. Like with much of the rest of the Burgundian financial system, Philip took inspiration from the French crown and decided that he would impose a new tax modeled after the Gabelle. The Gabelle was a consumption tax on salt, which provided the crown with about 9% of its total income, or about 160,000 livres. While the Gabelle was unpopular, it was also lucrative and consistent, as salt was a necessity both for preparing and preserving food. And Philip was already making money off of salt anyways, as he was a stakeholder in the salt works of Ceylon in the county of Burgundy, one of the major sources of salt in Europe at the time. 50 wagons of salt would leave Ceylon on a daily basis, bringing the mineral to much of the region, and revenue from the saltworks of Ceylon accounted for about half of the Duke's total income from the county of Burgundy. In terms of industrial activity, only wine surpassed salt's importance and scale in the two Burgundies. Philip the Good likely made up his mind about the tax towards the end of 1446, because in January of 1447, he approached the Colati, or Grand Council of Ghent, and pitched the tax to them. The Duke figured that if he were to impose the tax throughout his lands, the cooperation of Flanders, his richest and most tempestuous territory, would be necessary. And if he were to gain the cooperation of Flanders, he needed the cooperation of Ghent, which, despite being only the second richest city in Flanders, was certainly the most tempestuous. The Duke gave a somewhat revisionist version of the past few decades, described by Richard Vaughan as a, quote, hypocritical and tendentious review and justification of his policies and prospects. All of Philip's actions were either reframed to emphasize their benefit to Ghent and Flanders, or justified in other ways. The Duke began by talking about just how much he treasured Ghent. Quote, "I have entertained more favor, love, and friendship for this town, and all of you, than for any of my other towns. I have often made this clear by gladly and willingly conceding everything that you have sought and requested from me." On the war for Holland and Zeeland, the Duke made sure to emphasize the righteousness of his cause and the benefits for Flanders. Quote, "You also well know how, during a lull in the war in France, I had to wage a burdensome and murderous war against the English in my lands of Holland, Zeeland, and Friesland, in order to protect Flanders, and for other reasons. This war was fought with God and right on my side." And on the recent troubles with the Echo Shores, Philip noted, quote, "I resolved with God's help to remain in peace and quiet, and with my people's help to bring my lands, domains, and offices into a satisfactory state, and to maintain and uphold good government. But, in spite of this peace, I was treated shortly afterwards as if there was still open war, and no peace had been made." The gist of this speech was to emphasize all the costs that the Duke of Burgundy had incurred over the years, especially those costs which were related to the defense of Flanders, and to emphasize, quote, "the fear and uncertainty in which I stand because of wars on all sides when my treasury is empty." After really hammering that point home, Philip began pitching the salt tax. He lamented about his lack of funds and about the burden that the current level of taxation laid on his people. Quote, "Since my lands are emptied of gold, which is most grievous to me, and also in order to harm my people as little as possible, I have decided to levy a special tax for a term of years in Flanders and in all my lands and lordships on every measure of salt. This tax on salt will be paid by foreign merchants and others coming from abroad, and by my own subjects. And it should harm no one, least of all ordinary people and the poor, nor will they have to continue paying out money daily, as they do now, for the above-mentioned aid, which is most burdensome to them." And he continues to lay it on thick, quote, "And although it is true that it may bring in a little more than I receive annually in aids, you must appreciate that this will help me in minor routine expenses. Above all, these payments on salt will ruin nobody, but everyone will pay, without difficulty, and perhaps without even knowing it. The most notable people will pay the most, and, in particular, foreigners, monks and clerks, noblemen and burgesses, and others will pay more, each according to his estate, and the poor people will pay the least." Now, apart from the claim that, oh, the foreign merchants will pay the tax, and my people won't even notice, which us Americans can now tell from experience certainly is not true, Philip the Good was also being misleading about who would feel the tax the most. Although the Duke pitched his Gabelle as progressive, in effect the tax was regressive. While the rich would buy more salt than the poor, and thus pay more of the tax in absolute terms, for poor people, a far greater proportion of their income would be absorbed by this Burgundian Gabelle. To be fair, the Duke of Burgundy did promise that if the salt tax was approved, he would not request any other aids for the next 12 years. But, as he mentioned earlier in the speech, he did also expect this tax to bring in more money than the normal aids anyway. This is also ignoring the fact that the negotiations which occurred when the Duke requested an aid gave the members of Flanders and the estates of Philip's other territories the opportunity to raise issues and make their voices heard. Now, this process did not give the Burgundian assemblies the same level of influence as, say, the English Parliament, but it was still an important forum, and real concessions could be gained. Philip's revisionism was clocked by the Colati, and the Duke of Burgundy's request was firmly denied. The Duke then left Ghent in a huff, and to add insult to injury, when Philip the Good later tried to pitch Bruges and Ypres on the tax, the other members of Flanders followed Ghent's example and refused, which the Duke then blamed on Ghent's influence. Thus far, the Duke and the city had had a fairly good relationship. Sure, the city had rebelled a few times already during Philip's reign, but those had been relatively minor affairs in the grand scheme of things. Nothing on the scale of Bruges' revolt in the later 1430s, or Louis of Males's Ghent War. In general, the city had been amenable to Philip's requests, and the Duke of Burgundy had been amenable to Ghent's. This was not a hard and fast rule, but when the Colati of Ghent refused to accept Philip's tax, the Duke of Burgundy was genuinely surprised. The story of Philip's actions in the lead-up to the coming Ghent Revolt is sometimes seen as one of revenge, that the Duke was embarrassed by the city and wanted to get even. And while there likely was some element of personal emotion and wounded pride tied up in the conflict, I think that the Ghent Revolt was a power struggle, plain and simple, one between a centralizing duke and an independent-minded city. The refusal of the salt tax was not an instigating event due to how Philip felt about it, but due to the fact that it showed Philip the limits of his influence in Ghent and the consequences of that limited influence. The Duke of Burgundy now understood clearly that Ghent was the biggest check on his power in Flanders. Ghent was, without a doubt, the leading city in the Burgundian domains. Only Bruges came close to Ghent's size, power, and influence, and that city had been humbled back in 1438. Ghent, on the other hand, remained a power unto itself. Unlike Bruges, Ghent still dominated its quarter, and the town exercised judicial authority and political control over a large swath of eastern Flanders. One of the tools which Ghent used to project its power was its practice of granting citizenship to non-residents. These hageporters, citizens outside the walls, were given all the rights of the citizens inside the walls of Ghent. Most notably, the right to be subject to Ghent's jurisdiction in most judicial matters, rather than the comital courts. This was a powerful privilege which severely limited the reach of the Duke and his officers, and meant that if the Duke wanted to prosecute a citizen of Ghent, he would need the cooperation of the city. If you remember way back to Louis of Males's time, the Ghent War that destabilized the last years of his reign was sparked when that Count of Flanders had a citizen of Ghent arrested unilaterally. This privilege was taken seriously, and the people of Ghent were willing to come to blows to defend it. And again, it was not just the people in Ghent. Many of the leading men of Ghent's rural quarter were citizens of Ghent, as were many of the leading citizens in the smaller nearby towns. City air makes free was a common expression to describe the rights that burgesses had over peasants, and Ghent's city air went far past its walls. Moreover, the burgesses of Ghent exercised more control over their town's government than the residents of most other towns did. Throughout the Burgundian Netherlands, the Duke had anywhere between significant influence and outright control over the selection of town magistrates. We saw last episode that in many of the towns of Holland and Zeeland, the Duke selected magistrates from a list which a committee of townsmen provided him, and in Bruges, the Duke was able to directly appoint magistrates, although his choices were subject to approval by the city council. In Ghent, the most important magistracies were the bailiff, the overdeans of the guilds, and the boards of aldermen. The bailiff of Ghent differed from the other offices in the city, as at the end of the day the bailiff was a comital appointee, and answered to Philip as Count of Flanders. The bailiff was essentially a combination sheriff and prosecutor, and the office represents an interesting balance between comital and civic authority. While the citizens of Ghent were subject to the city's courts rather than the count's, the civic courts still required the bailiff to function. Without the bailiff, criminals could not be pursued or properly tried, and the wheels of justice would grind to a halt. Thus, Philip's control over the office of bailiff was one of the few ways that he could intervene directly in Ghent, and as things escalate, we will see him do just that. While the bailiffs were ultimately answerable to the Duke of Burgundy, the overdeans were ultimately answerable to the guilds. One of the overdeans was always the head dean of the Weavers' Guild, while the other was selected from among the deans of the other craft guilds. The overdeans were, in essence, the bridge between the guilds and the government of Ghent. They represented the guilds to the town government, they chaired meetings of the guilds, they regulated disputes between the guilds, and more. They also had a lot of de facto power in the government as the voice of the guilds, and could thus easily influence appointments, legislation, and more, even if that was all technically outside their official duties. The two boards of aldermen, the Law Board and the Estate Board, were in charge of justice and administration. The Law Board was, unsurprisingly, the source of law in Ghent, but they also acted as a register for contracts, always important in a town where commerce and industry were so widespread, supervised the administration of Ghent, and acted as a court for many legal issues. The Estate Board dealt with the more day-to-day parts of justice and administration, and acted as justices of the peace for the city. The Duke had basically no say over the selection of the overdeans, and his influence over the elections of the aldermen, while not negligible, was still limited. This was for a few reasons. First, although the Duke was able to appoint half the electors who chose the aldermen each year, whenever there was a tie, the Duke's electors were made to give way, and so the Duke could not really appoint any aldermen objectionable to the other electors. Second, due to all the civic convulsions that Ghent went through in the 13th and 14th centuries, the different orders of the town, or members of Ghent, each had a fixed share of seats on the two boards of aldermen. The 3 members of Ghent, not to be confused with the 4 members of Flanders, were the patricians or landowners, the weavers, and the rest of the craft guilds. The patricians controlled 3 seats on each board, while the weavers and small guilds both controlled 5 seats per board. So, while the Duke of Burgundy may have liked to stuff the boards of aldermen with patricians friendly to his cause, he couldn't, even if he had had total control over the electors. The political power of the guilds was not only expressed through their majority on the boards of aldermen, they also dominated the Colati, the Great Council, which was made up of the deans of each of the 52 small guilds, 23 representatives from the weavers, and just 10 patricians. The Colati originally only met during emergencies, but as time went on, it met more often, and gained some routine functions, such as acting as a court of appeals above the boards of aldermen, and overseeing Ghent's delegations to meetings of the 4 members of Flanders. And not only was Philip's influence in Ghent limited by the space in the administration carved out for the guilds, but it was also limited by the fact that the Duke's party in Ghent was fairly weak. In Bruges, Ypres, and most of the other towns of the Burgundian Netherlands, the Dukes of Burgundy had cultivated networks of clients that could maintain Burgundian influence without them needing to intervene directly. And it was really this form of soft power that tended to be the most effective in allowing the dukes to get their way. While there was a ducal party in Ghent, its ability to control events in the city was lacking. After the Colati refused the duke's salt tax, Philip's first move was to identify his friends and foes in the city. His friends would be tasked with further building up the duke's network of clients, while his foes would have to be forced out of power. The Duke of Burgundy fixed his ire on Daneel Sersanders, Lievin Sneevoet, and Lievin de Pottere, leaders of the craft guilds who had gathered a party of other anti-ducal craft guildsmen around them, which creatively became known as the party of Daneel and his friends. A few months later, the Duke had his first chance to move against Sersanders and test the strength of his own party, when the anti-ducal politician stood for the office of Overdean of the craft guilds. Sersanders mobilized his friends in the city while the Duke mobilized his, and, as the votes came in, the guildsmen won out. Once again, the Duke of Burgundy was frustrated by his limited influence in Ghent, and resolved to increase his power in the city, or if you prefer, his power over the city. The Duke of Burgundy would not make his next move right away. He continued working to build support in the city, and he was waiting for the right opportunity to assert his dominance. That opportunity would come 2 years later during another round of elections. In the elections of 1449, Lievin de Pottere was elected Overdene of the Craft Guilds, and Daneel and the other Lievin were elected aldermen, which once again demonstrated the limits of Philip's attempts at party building in Ghent. But still, the Duke now had an opportunity to force the issue, and he rejected the election results, claiming that certain irregularities had prevented it from being done fairly. Now, Philip was right in that there were irregularities in the elections of 1449, but what he failed to mention was that the irregularities were coming from the ducal faction. Peter Baudon, a ducal secretary and one of the election commissioners, had attempted to influence the election, first by trying to secure promises of support from the electors, then by gathering a posse of armed men in an attempt to intimidate the electors, and then, when things still seemed to be going against the ducal cause, by leaving Ghent with another of the election commissioners instead of just doing his job. So yes, the elections were held under the auspices of the aldermen rather than the Duke's election commissioners, which did technically give Philip a case, but the elections needed to be held, and the Duke's officers refused to do their job when it looked like they would not get their way. Regardless of the fact that the interference was coming from inside the house, the Duke refused to accept the results of the election and demanded that they be rerun. The civic authorities in Ghent did not want to simply roll over, and decided to appeal to the 4 members of Flanders to decide the case, while in response, the Duke decided to appeal to the 3 estates of Flanders, a rarely called assembly without nearly the same power and influence as the 4 members, but one which was generally much more amenable to ducal demands. Ghent decided to follow the Duke's lead here, and ended up making their case to the estates of Flanders as well. The civic authorities argued that, yes, there were some irregularities, but those were just due to the actions of Peter Baudon and the other ducal officers. They then agreed to redo the elections of 1449, but demanded assurances that the Duke and his officers would not interfere in those elections, or in the internal matters of the city more generally. Philip the Good did not take the deal. Over the next few months, Duke and city entered into strained negotiations, where the Duke did his best to chip away at the independence of the city, and most especially the rights of Ghent's hageporters, those non-resident burgesses, to avoid ducal justice. In order to apply more pressure against Ghent, Philip also ordered his bailiff and other officers out of the city, which put a stop to many routine legal procedures. And he also had his officers try and skirt around the city's privileges whenever possible. Philip's goal here can be seen from an order he gave in August of 1450, where he instructed his officers to only recognize the rights of the burghers of Ghent as defined in a charter from 1297. The Duke wanted to roll back the clock on all the rights that the city had secured over the course of the tumultuous 14th century. With all that being said, the brewing conflict was not purely the case of a power-hungry duke trying to restrict the freedoms of his townsfolk, even if it was mostly that. There were many cases where Ghent's officers really did overstep the bounds of their authority to enforce their town's power over other smaller towns and across the countryside, and even some cases of Ghent trying to oversee or discipline the duke's own officers. So even though Ghent eventually gave in and allowed the elections of 1449 to be redone without the guarantees previously demanded, now more grievances had arisen between the city and the Duke, and the wider questions surrounding the balance of power remained unanswered. Tensions rose further over the next year as the Duke demanded more restrictions on the independence of the city and on the freedoms granted to its citizens, once again with an emphasis on restricting the Aja porters and limiting Ghent's power outside its walls. Still, though, negotiation continued. The Colati of Ghent listened to Philip's grievances and made several concessions, such as increasing residency requirements for their Haja porters, agreeing to limit the jurisdiction of their officers outside the walls of Ghent, and promising to only exercise judgment over Philip's officers with the consent of the ducal bailiff. And in exchange, all Philip granted was allowing his bailiff and other officers to return to Ghent and restarting the wheels of justice. Little by little, the Duke of Burgundy was increasing his power over the city, but there was something of an ebb and flow going on. So, due to the ongoing dispute between Ghent and Philip, the elections of 1450 were also held without the input of the Duke's election commissioners, and a few months later, Philip briefly withdrew his bailiff again. But other than that, things appeared to quiet down for a bit. That period of quiet would come to an end in the spring of 1451, when the Duke of Burgundy sent a letter to Ghent complaining about, quote, "the great crimes, offences, treacheries, perjuries, and excesses which have been done and committed against us and our honour by Daneel Sersanders, Lievin de Pottere, Lievin Sneevoet, and others of their faction." The letter rambles on about how the guildsmen conspired to slander and defame the Duke, how they deceived the people of Ghent to maintain their hold on power, how they're usurping the Duke's rights and privileges, how they're preventing the Duke's officers from doing their jobs, and how they personally swore to the Duke that they would support his salt tax, and then turned around and led the opposition to it. The Duke demanded that Daneel, Lievin, and Lievin be dismissed from their officers, but this letter only galvanized the opposition of the Ghenters, who refused the demand. Philip then summoned the aldermen of Ghent to answer his demands in person. This now prompted a protest from the aldermen, who claimed that the summons infringed on their privileges, and in a bit of departure of form for this conflict, now it was the Duke of Burgundy who decided to lower the temperature a bit. The Duke once again wrote to the aldermen of Ghent, this time assuring them of the great love that he had for their city and its good people, that he only wanted to ensure that his rights of lordship were respected, that he had the utmost respect for Ghent's city rights, and that they all would receive pardons for whatever misdeeds they had committed against him. Now assured that they were not walking into a trap, the aldermen went to the Duke, where he addressed them directly and in Flemish, which was a nice touch. Philip reiterated the earlier points and promised that his only desire was to be a good lord for all of them, and he hoped that they would be his good people. The aldermen then apologized for all that they had done against the Duke's interests, and invited Philip to Ghent. A joyous entry was in the making. Now the time was right to press the issue, and Philip said, "Oh, I'd love to come to Ghent, but I can't while those nasty troublemakers, Sersanders, Sneevoet, and de Pottere, are in power. Those three are greater lords in the city than I am, and it simply won't do to have my prestige insulted like that." So the aldermen returned to Ghent, followed by ducal officers carrying letters from Philip which stated that the Duke of Burgundy was prepared to forgive all of Ghent for all their insults and insolence, except for Daneel Sersanders, Lievin Sneevoet, and Lievin de Pottere. The Duke now summoned the three guildsmen to him, but did give promises that no harm would come to them. It seemed that the price of ending the conflict was to be Daneel, Lievin, and Lievin. The aldermen were eager to put this all to bed, and the three guildsmen agreed to face the Duke's music. The three men came to the Duke and, on their knees, recounted all their misdeeds, and here they were essentially just repeating the Duke's previous letters to Ghent rather than speaking from the heart. And with that act of contrition done, all three were exiled from Flanders. Back in Ghent, A rumor was spreading that despite the Duke's assurances, Daneel, Lievin, and Lievin had been killed. As all three had agreed to bear the brunt of the Duke's wrath for Ghent's forgiveness, their popularity was at an all-time high, and the rumors of their executions rallied the people of Ghent. 2 days after the guildsmen left Ghent, the masses proclaimed a general strike and began to demonstrate against the Duke. But before things could spiral out of control, the guild leaders' wives came out and assured the crowd that their husbands were still alive. The brewing revolt dissipated, and Daneel, Lievin, and Lievin prepared to leave the city. The upheaval had forced the year's elections to be postponed, but about a week later the elections of 1451 took place without incident. For a little while it looked like the Duke of Burgundy had won. The new boards of aldermen were amenable to Philip, and the Duke had gotten rid of the three most notable troublemakers in the city. The political class of Ghent had bent the knee, but the resentment fostered by the extended quarrel between the Duke and the city had not gone away. On the morning of October 4th, 1451, as the aldermen of Ghent arrived at City Hall, they found an ominous warning nailed to the door. "You, cowards of Ghent, who now hold the government, we will not suffer you any longer, but will raise up a new Artefelda." Thank you so much to my patrons: Christine, Duchesse de Nemours; Elliot, Graf von Gravenstein; Anthony, Comte de Chateauneuf-Nuxois; Preston, Comte de Saint-Fargeau; Mark, Comte de Merceau; Diana, Graf von Beersel; Mehmet, Comte Santerre; Chris, Comte de Semur; Rosa, Comte de Germol; Elliot, Comte de Bussy-Legrand; Eric, Comte de Couche; David, Graf von Barland; Jonathan, Comte de Bezoche; Olivier, Comte d'Ussert; John, Graf von Helmont; Spencer, Graf von Breda; Craig, Graf von Hoensbroek; Lexi, Comte de Blancmont; Bennett, Comte de Courcelles; David, Comte d'Auricourt; James, Graf von Dussen; and to my Knights of the Duchy. If you want to join them, you can at patreon.com/ValoisBurgundy. If you want to support the podcast in other ways, you can do so by leaving a review on your podcast app of choice and telling your friends about the show. Both really help to grow the show and will earn you my everlasting appreciation. If you want to keep up with the show, you can follow me at ValoisBurgundy on Twitter or Blue Sky, or find Grand Dukes of the West on Facebook. You can also email me at granddukesofthewest@gmail.com, and check out the podcast website for maps, images, sources, and more at granddukesofthewest.com. Once again, thank you for listening.